He hangs from a wind-swept branch, swaying above the void. Pierced by a cold iron spear, he bleeds into the dark below. 9 nights of agony endured for secret wisdom. Forget the golden, benevolent grandfather of cinema. This is somnolent. Odin was not a god of peace, but a paranoid war deity obsessed with delaying his own inevitable death. A desperate king trading eyes and lives to outrun his fate. To understand why a god would eventually sacrifice his own eye for a glimpse of the future, we must first look back to the silence that preceded the world. It was a silence not of peace, but of a terrifying predatory potential. Before the first mountain was raised, before the first fire was kindled, there was only Ginnungagap. This was the yawning abyss, a bottomless throat of nothingness that sat between 2 lethal extremes. To the north lay the world of mist and paralyzing cold, and to the south the world of unrelenting, screaming heat. For eons, these 2 forces crept toward one another across the void. When the freezing frost finally met the blowing embers, the air began to thicken. In that collision of ice and fire, the first spark of life did not emerge as something beautiful or divine. It emerged as something monstrous. Out of the melting slush rose Ymir, the first of the giants. He was a creature of raw, undirected instinct, a hulking entity of cosmic scale who drifted in the half-light of the abyss. He was not a creator, nor was he a father in any traditional sense. He was simply a presence, an ancient witness to the emptiness. But as the ice continued to drip, more beings were stirred into existence, eventually leading to the birth of 3 brothers, Odin, Vili, and Ve. These were the first of the Aesir, the first beings to possess a conscious will and a hunger for order. They looked upon the vast drifting form of Ymir, and they did not see a grandfather or a sacred ancestor. They saw an obstacle. They saw a chaotic waste of space and matter that served no purpose other than to exist. It was here, in the very dawn of time, that the character of the Allfather was truly forged. Odin did not seek a peaceful compromise with the ancient forces of the world. He did not ask for permission to build his kingdom. Instead, he and his brothers chose the path of the blade. They fell upon the giant Ymir in a frantic, bloody struggle, a cosmic act of fratricide that would stain the history of the universe before it had even truly begun. The death of Ymir was not a clean or quick mercy. It was a systematic, visceral dismantling of the only other living thing in existence. When the brothers struck the final blow, the blood that erupted from Ymir's throat was so vast in its volume that it became a literal tide of death. It swept across the void, drowning almost the entire race of giants that had begun to spring from Ymir's sweat. This was the first genocide, the first time life was snuffed out to make room for a new vision. Odin stood in the center of this red deluge, not as a savior, but as a butcher. He and his brothers took the cooling remains of their kin and began the grim work of construction. They didn't plant a garden, they carved a fortress out of a corpse. They dragged Ymir's body into the center of the void and began to pull him apart. They took his flesh and spread it out to form the earth we walk upon. His blood, which had already claimed so many lives, was gathered and shaped into the vast, salt-heavy oceans. If you stand on a beach today and listen to the rhythmic pulse of the waves, you are listening to the final, dying heartbeat of a murdered ancestor. They took his unshattered bones and broke them further to create the jagged mountains and the high crags. His teeth and the splinters of his skeletal frame were scattered to become the stones and the pebbles that tripped the feet of travelers. This world was not a gift from the divine, it was a repurposed carcass. The brothers then reached into the giant's skull, lifting the heavy bowl of his bone upward to create the dome of the sky, pinning it over the earth to trap the air. To give that sky light, they caught stray sparks from the fires of the south and threw them into the heights, creating the stars that mock the darkness. Even the clouds that drift lazily on a summer afternoon were once the brain matter of Ymir, tossed into the air by the hands of his killers. Every aspect of the natural world is a reminder of the violence required to bring it into being. There is no innocence in this geography. Every step we take on the solid ground is supported by the remains of a being that had to die so that we might exist. This is the heavy burden that Odin carried from his first moments of power. He is a king who rules over a graveyard he himself helped to fill. He transformed chaos into order, but the cost was his own soul and the blood of his predecessors. By building the world from a corpse, he tied the fate of that world to the same decay that claimed Ymir. He knew even then that a house built on such a foundation could never truly be stable. The violence used to create the world established a cycle that could only end in more violence. This was not the act of a benevolent deity providing for his children. It was the act of a desperate survivor, carving a sanctuary out of the only material available. Odin did not just create the world, he doomed it. From the very beginning, the Allfather understood that existence is a debt paid in blood. And as the years stretched into eons, he would become increasingly obsessed with how to defer the final payment. That shadow of the void demanded a defense, and Odin found it in the architecture of power. To survive the coming darkness, he knew he could not remain a solitary wanderer. He needed an empire. Yet the first attempt to organize the divine forces resulted not in a peaceful union, but in the first war the world had ever seen. This was a collision of fundamental principles. On one side stood the Aesir, Odin's tribe, focused on the expansion of civilization, the rigidity of law, and the glory of the spear. On the other were the Vanir, an older, more enigmatic group of deities who commanded the fertility of the earth and the shifting tides of the sea. The conflict did not begin with a grand declaration, but with a betrayal. When a Vanir practitioner of strange magics named Gulweg entered the halls of the Aesir, she spoke of nothing but gold and the power of desire. The Aesir, perhaps fearing the influence of her wilder, more ancient sorcery, attempted to execute her. They riddled her with spears and cast her into the fire 3 times, yet each time she stepped out of the flames, reborn and smiling. This failed execution triggered a cycle of violence that spanned generations. It was a war of attrition where neither side could gain a permanent advantage. The walls of Odin's rising citadel were smashed by the Vanir's magic, while the Aesir's iron-fisted tactics devastated the natural lands of their rivals. Odin realized that a king who rules over ruins is no king at all. He saw that the Aesir possessed the structure, but the Vanir possessed the vitality. If he was to secure his throne against the creeping reach of the void, he had to integrate his enemies rather than annihilate them. The peace treaty that followed was a masterclass in political maneuvering. It was anchored by an exchange of hostages, a common practice in the ancient world, designed to ensure that neither side could strike without sacrificing their own kin. The Vanir sent their most vital figures into the heart of Odin's city. Njord, the lord of the salt seas, came with his twin children, Freyr and Freya. They brought with them the secrets of the harvest and the intimate magics of the soul, qualities the Aesir had previously lacked. In return, Odin sent his brother Hoenir and the wise Mimir. This was more than a simple trade, it was a merger of two distinct ways of living. By bringing the Vanir into his inner circle, Odin didn't just end a war, he consolidated the fragmented forces of the divine into a single, unified hierarchy. He was no longer just a tribal leader, he was the architect of a new social order. At the center of this newly fortified society sat the domestic and political heart of the high seat. To solidify his standing, Odin leaned on his union with Frigg. While later stories might diminish her to a figure of quiet domesticity, she was in truth his most essential political ally. Born of the older race of giants, Frigg provided Odin with a vital link to the primal forces that preceded the gods. She was the only one permitted to sit upon his throne and look out across the 9 worlds. While Odin obsessed over the acquisition of knowledge, Frigg possessed a natural silent understanding of fate. She knew the destination of every soul and the outcome of every choice, yet she kept her counsel. Her presence in the hall gave Odin's rule a legitimacy and a stability that blood alone could not buy. Below the Allfather and his queen, the hierarchy took on a more martial tone. This was the era of Thor, Odin's son, the enforcer of the divine will. If Odin was the subtle mind of the administration, Thor was its heavy hand. Born of the earth herself, Thor represented the raw physical protection of the borders. He became the shield that allowed the political games of the High Hall to continue. With his hammer, he patrolled the outskirts, ensuring that the chaos of the giants remained outside the walls of their carefully constructed civilization. This period marked the transformation of a group of disparate spirits into a structured government. The Aesir were the aristocrats, the warriors, and the judges, while the Vanir became the clergy and the providers. Together, they formed a fortress of gold and order, standing defiantly against the wildness of the cosmos. Yet this consolidation of power carried a hidden cost. By weaving together such different and often conflicting forces, Odin had created a system that was incredibly powerful, but also deeply fragile. The peace was maintained through a delicate balance of hostages, marriages, and shared secrets. As the walls grew higher and the hierarchy more rigid, the Allfather's paranoia didn't fade, it shifted. He had secured his kingdom, but in doing so, he had created a world with a lot to lose, and the shadows he had seen in the void were beginning to move closer to the gates he had so carefully built. The gates of Asgard stood firm, a testament to the order Odin had imposed upon a chaotic universe. Yet the silence within those walls had become heavy. He had secured his kingdom, but in doing so, he had created a world with a lot to lose, and the shadows he had seen in the void were beginning to move closer to the gates he had so carefully built. He realized that walls of stone and armies of gods would never be enough to protect what he had made. Strength was a finite resource, a tool that eventually blunts against the grindstone of time. To save his creation, he needed something far more dangerous than a spear. He needed to see what was coming before it reached the horizon. He needed to understand the mechanics of fate itself. This realization sparked an obsession that would define the rest of his existence. Odin began to look past the borders of his dominion, ignoring the comforts of his throne, to gaze into the dark places where the laws of the universe were written. He felt a gnawing hunger for a perspective that no mortal or god had ever possessed. He was no longer content to react to the world. He wanted to anticipate it. This hunger led him away from the high halls and down into the damp, lightless depths where the foundations of reality take root. He began a long descent, shedding the golden finery of a king for the weather-beaten cloak of a wanderer. He moved toward the very center of the cosmos, where the massive, gnarled roots of the world tree, Yggdrasil, plunge into the primordial earth. The air here was different, thick with the scent of ancient moss and the cold, metallic tang of deep water. There was no wind here, only the slow, rhythmic pulsing of the tree as it drew life from the hidden springs below. At the base of one of these great roots lies the well of Mimir. It is not a place of beauty, but a place of terrifying clarity. The water within it does not reflect the sky. It holds the memory of every event that has ever occurred and the seeds of every event yet to pass. To drink from it is to consume the collective wisdom of the ages, to see the connections between cause and effect that remain invisible to those blinded by the present moment. But the well was not unguarded. It was watched over by Mimir, a figure of immense age and ambiguous nature. Mimir did not simply give away the secrets of the universe. He understood that knowledge of this magnitude must be bought with something of equal value. When Odin reached the edge of the well, he did not find a benevolent teacher. He found a gatekeeper who demanded a price that most would find unthinkable. Mimir did not ask for gold, for the gods have plenty of it. He did not ask for land or for the lives of enemies. He looked at the king of the gods and demanded a part of his very self. He demanded Odin's right eye. The weight of this transaction cannot be overstated. In the warrior culture of the North, an eye was a symbol of physical prowess and a warrior's ability to defend himself. To lose an eye was to become vulnerable, to lose the depth perception required for the hunt and the battlefield. But the symbolic cost was even higher. Odin was being asked to give up his outward vision, the way he saw the material world, in exchange for an internal cosmic sight. He was being asked to mutilate his own perfection to attain a wisdom that would likely bring him more pain than joy. Odin did not hesitate. The legends describe the act with a chilling lack of ceremony. Standing over the dark water, surrounded by the oppressive silence of the world's roots, he reached into his own face and tore the eye from its socket. The agony must have been a white-hot flash that threatened to shatter his mind, yet he remained upright. He handed the bloody orb to Mimir, who dropped it into the well. There it sank, settling into the dark silt at the bottom. It remains there still, a permanent witness to the depths, staring upward through the water while its counterpart looks out at the world above. Only after this sacrifice was Odin permitted to drink. He lowered a horn into the well and drew up the cold, heavy liquid. As he drank, the universe shifted. The world he knew, the world of mountains, halls, and battles, fell away, replaced by a terrifying understanding of the grand design. He saw the beginning of time with a clarity that made his previous memories feel like shadows. More importantly, he saw the end. He saw the inevitable arrival of the great winter, the breaking of the sun, and the final bloody confrontation on the fields of Vigrid. He saw his own death, his sons falling in battle, and the eventual drowning of the world in a rising black sea. When he finally pulled away from the well, the chieftain who had descended into the roots was gone. In his place stood something far more complex and far more dangerous. He was no longer just a ruler. He was a seer, a sorcerer god, who carried the burden of knowing exactly how his story would end. The sacrifice of his eye had fundamentally changed his nature. He had traded the simple, direct vision of a king for the fractured, layered vision of a prophet. This moment redefined the Allfather. He would forever after be known as the Einwand god, a figure who lurks in the periphery of human affairs, his face half hidden by a wide-brimmed hat. He had gained the wisdom he sought, but it was a cold comfort. He now understood that the shadows he had seen in the void were not just moving closer, they were his destiny. Every move he made from that day forward, every manipulation of heroes, and every hoarding of souls was a calculated attempt to use his hard-won foresight to change a future that he now knew was written in stone. He had paid the ultimate price for a gift that allowed him to see the end of all things, only to realize that even a god is a prisoner of the truth he uncovers. But vision alone was a hollow victory. Knowing the shape of the end provides no comfort if one lacks the tools to carve a different path or the language to command the forces of the void. Odin had seen the shadow of the wolf and the burning of the world, but he remained a passenger in his own prophecy. To bridge the gap between witness and master, he understood that a second, far more harrowing price had to be paid. This was not a debt owed to a guardian like Mimir, but a debt he owed to the very structure of existence. To gain the secrets of the universe, he would have to offer up the only thing that carried equal weight, himself. He turned his gaze toward the center of all things, to the great ash tree that anchors the various worlds in its sprawling limbs. This was the pillar of the cosmos, a living bridge between the heights of the heavens and the freezing depths of the underworld. It was here, upon the wind-swept branches of the world tree, that Odin staged the most paradoxical ritual in all of myth. He did not go to the tree to find shade or shelter. He went there to die. He climbed into the heights where the air grows thin and the silence of the stars becomes deafening. There he fashioned a noose and fixed it to a sturdy bough. He did not seek a quick or merciful transition. To ensure his suffering was total, he took his spear and drove the iron point deep into his own side, pinning his flesh to the wood of the tree. Then he stepped off into the emptiness. For 9 long nights, the Allfather hung between the worlds, suspended by a rope and a blade, a swaying corpse that refused to let go of its spirit. The cruelty of this act is difficult to overstate. He was not fed, nor was he given a single drop of water to soothe his parched throat. He was left to the mercy of the biting winds that howl through the gaps between the stars. His blood dripped down the trunk of the tree, soaking into the bark, feeding the very roots that held him captive. In this state of prolonged agony, the boundaries of his identity began to dissolve. He was the king of the gods, yet he was also a common criminal on a gallows. He was the seeker of wisdom, yet he was also the sacrifice. This is the core of the mystery often described as Odin sacrificing himself to himself. It is a concept that defies human logic. There was no higher power to appease, no external judge to grant him a reward. The sacrifice was an internal transaction of the highest order. He was breaking his own ego, shattering his divine form so that the essence underneath could reach out and grasp the fundamental laws of reality. He had to become nothing to understand everything. As the days bled into one another, his physical senses failed. His sight went dark, his hearing faded, and the pain in his side became a dull, rhythmic thrumming that matched the heartbeat of the world tree itself. In the depths of that 9th night, as he teetered on the very edge of total annihilation, something moved in the darkness below. From the abyss beneath the roots, the secret symbols of the universe began to reveal themselves. These were the runes. They were not merely an alphabet for men to write poems or record history. They were the primal laws of nature made manifest. They were the vibrations of creation, the geometry of magic, and the keys to every lock in existence. Through his suffering, Odin had finally made himself thin enough for these truths to pass through him. With a final shattering cry of exertion, he reached down through the agony and the cold. He grasped the runes, pulling them from the void and searing their shapes into his mind. In that moment the rope snapped, or the wood gave way, and he fell from the tree, screaming as the sudden influx of power flooded his broken frame. He had returned from the brink, but he was no longer the god who had climbed up. He had survived the gallows, and in doing so, he had claimed dominion over the transition between life and death. This transformation marked a definitive shift in his nature. By hanging on the tree, he became the first and greatest of the necro-magicians. He had walked the path of the dead and returned with their secrets, granting him the ability to command the spirits of those who had passed. He became the Lord of the Gallows, a figure who could sit beneath a swinging corpse and force it to speak, dragging the secrets of the grave into the light of day. This was a dark and terrible wisdom, one that separated him from the warmth of the hearth and the simple morality of the living. A god who hangs himself for power is not a god who values comfort or conventional goodness. He had become a creature of obsession, a being who viewed the entire universe as a series of codes to be broken and spirits to be utilized. The runes gave him the power to heal the sick, to blunt the swords of his enemies, and to bind the minds of others to his will. But they also reinforced his isolation. He was now the master of the hidden world, a sorcerer who dealt in the currency of pain and the cold whispers of the departed. As he stood at the base of the world tree, clutching the newfound power of the runes, the gap between the Allfather and the mortals who worshipped him grew into a canyon. He was now the master of language and magic, the one who could rewrite the laws of the world he had helped create. Yet the price of this mastery was a permanent hardening of his spirit. He had looked into the void and found that it answered only to those willing to suffer without limit. He was the hanged god, a title he would carry forever, a reminder that the greatest secrets are never given freely. They must be torn from the darkness at the cost of one's own soul. He was no longer a god of the sun or the soil. He had become a creature of the edges, a shadow moving between the cracks of the world he helped build. This transformation required a mask. He could not walk among men or giants as the king of the high seat. That radiance would burn away the very secrets he sought to steal. Instead, he became the wanderer. To the common folk of Midgard, he was a tall, gray-bearded figure, draped in a cloak the color of a bruised sky, his face partially hidden by the drooping brim of a traveler's hat. He was Grimnir, the Hooded One. He walked the dusty roads not to offer blessings, but to observe, to manipulate, and to take. He was a predator in the guise of a beggar, a man who had traded his comfort for the privilege of seeing the world as it truly was, a place of shifting loyalties and hidden strengths. The greatest prize of his early travels was not gold or land, but the essence of inspiration itself. The mead of poetry was a substance born of blood and betrayal. It was the fermented wisdom of Kvasir, a man created from the collective spittle of the gods, who was later murdered by dwarves. His essence was brewed into 3 great vats. This liquid did not just provide talent, it granted the user the ability to speak with the weight of the universe, to weave truth and lies so perfectly that they became indistinguishable from reality. For a man preparing for the end of time, such a tool was more valuable than 1,000 spears. To possess the mead was to possess the power to move hearts and shape the narrative of the future. Odin did not demand the mead through combat or divine right. He knew the giant Suttungr kept it locked deep within the mountain Hnitbjörg, guarded by his daughter Gunnlod. Odin's path to the mountain began with a calculated slaughter. He came across 9 thralls mowing hay, and with a subtle display of sharpening their scythes to a lethal edge, he induced them to kill each other in a frenzy of greed for his whetstone. With the workers dead, Odin offered his services to their master, Baugi, under the name Bolverk, the evildoer. It was a title he wore with a dark pride, a signal that he had moved beyond the constraints of conventional morality. He worked a full summer of back-breaking labor in the fields, his single eye always fixed on the stony face of the mountain. When the harvest was done and the time came for payment, Baugi could not provide the mead. Odin did not rage, he simply produced an auger named Rati. He forced the giant to bore a hole through the solid rock, testing his resolve at every turn. As soon as the stone gave way, Odin transformed into a snake and slid into the darkness of the mountain's belly. There, in the cold, silent depths of the earth, he found Gunnlod. She was a guardian, but she was also isolated. Odin did not hesitate to use her loneliness against her. He did not see a woman to be loved, he saw a door to be opened. For 3 nights he shared her bed. He spoke words of false warmth, trading the intimacy of his body for sips of the precious liquid. He seduced her not out of desire, but out of a cold, mechanical necessity. Once the 3 vats were drained into his gullet, he did not offer a single word of thanks or a parting glance of affection. He took the form of a hawk and soared out of the mountain, leaving behind a broken woman and a stolen legacy. This act highlights the fundamental friction at the heart of the Aesir. If Thor had been tasked with retrieving the mead, he would have smashed the mountain to dust and fought Suttungr in a test of raw, honest strength. Thor's world is one of binaries, right and wrong, friend and foe, strength and weakness. He is the hammer that strikes the nail. But Odin operates in the gray. He is a god who understands that honor is a luxury for those who do not have a world to save. He is a liar, a thief, and a seducer, and he views these labels not as insults, but as essential tools of his trade. To him, the ends always justify the means, no matter how much filth he must drag his name through to achieve them. He is willing to be the villain in someone else's story if it ensures the survival of his own. He returned to the halls of his peers, with his throat burning from the stolen wisdom, spitting the mead into jars for the gods to share. But he kept the finest portions for himself. He had become a master of the word, a poet of the grim reality. Yet every victory of this nature carved away at what remained of his spirit. He was becoming less like the father of his people and more like the very giants he feared, cunning, cold, and utterly self-serving. He moved through the world of men like a ghost, watching the mortals struggle, sometimes stirring the pot of their wars just to see which heroes might rise to the surface. He needed those heroes for his own ends, and he would lie to every one of them to get what he wanted. The wanderer's tracks are found in the blood of the innocent and the songs of the wise alike. He does not care for the morality of the hearth or the sanctity of the marriage bed. He cares for the survival of the collective, a survival bought with the currency of individual suffering. He is the guest who leaves your lander empty and your mind filled with dangerous, restless ideas. As he moved through the wilderness of Midgard, the weight of the stolen mead sat heavy in his stomach, a constant reminder that power is never granted by the heavens, it is always taken from the hands of the unsuspecting, and usually from those who were foolish enough to trust a man with one eye and a crooked smile. He was the architect of his own infamy, wandering toward a destiny he had seen in the stars, unburdened by the weight of a conscience. That absence of guilt was the primary engine of his ambition, driving him to construct a system that prioritized his survival over the sanctity of human life. We often look at the concept of Valhalla through a modernized, sanitized lens, viewing it as a Norse equivalent to a peaceful afterlife. We imagine a golden sanctuary where the brave find rest and the weary find comfort. But that is a profound misunderstanding of the architecture Odin established. Valhalla was never a heaven. It was a cold, calculated military barracks. It was a logistical solution to a cosmic problem. If we look past the poetry and the songs, the structure of the hall reveals a much darker intent. This was a storage facility for a specific type of resource, the souls of the violent. To understand the Hall of the Slain, one must first look at its construction. The sagas describe a roof thatched with golden shields and rafters made of spears. This is not the aesthetic of a place designed for relaxation. It is a fortress designed for a siege. The men inside, the Einarjar, were not guests of honor. They were conscripts in a standing army. Their daily existence was a grueling cycle of industrial-scale violence. Every morning, at the crowing of the cock, these men marched out to a vast field to butcher one another. They spent their days perfecting the art of the kill, severing limbs and piercing hearts in a display of repetitive, meaningless slaughter. Then, as evening fell, their wounds were healed, and they returned to the hall to consume the flesh of a beast that was slaughtered and resurrected every single day. This was not a reward for their bravery on earth. It was a high-intensity training program intended to keep their reflexes sharp and their spirits accustomed to the sight of blood. Odin didn't want them to find peace. Peace would make them soft. He needed them to remain in a state of perpetual readiness, sharp and jagged as the shards of a broken blade, waiting for the day the sun would be devoured and the final war would begin. The procurement of these soldiers was handled by a group of entities we have come to romanticize as winged spirits of mercy. The Valkyries, however, were far more clinical in their duties. In the ancient tongue, their name translates to the choosers of the slain, and that choice was rarely governed by a sense of fairness. They were the Allfather's talent scouts. They hovered over the shield walls of our world, not to protect the righteous, but to audit the effective. They watched the blood-soaked mud of every skirmish with a cold, analytical gaze, searching for the specific brand of desperation and skill that Odin required for his final defense. When they identified a warrior of exceptional utility, they didn't intervene to save him. On the contrary, their presence often signaled his doom. If a man was too good at surviving, he was of no use to Odin in the halls of the dead. To be chosen was not an act of grace, it was a targeted assassination of the elite. This creates a terrifying dynamic between the god and his followers. Because Odin needed a constant influx of high-quality soldiers, he could not afford for the world of men to be at peace. A century of tranquility, to him, was a century of wasted inventory. If the kings of the north grew content with their borders and the farmers spent their lives behind a plow instead of a shield, the supply of Einarjar would dry up. The best men would grow old and die in their beds, their souls slipping away to the quiet gray domain of the goddess Hel, where Odin had no jurisdiction. To prevent this, he became the ultimate instigator. He was the invisible hand that broke treaties and the whisper in the dark that turned brothers against each other. He sowed the seeds of betrayal specifically to harvest the resulting carnage. He didn't just watch wars, he manufactured them. He was a predator of human potential, trading the stability of human civilizations for the fortification of his own private army. There are stories of legendary heroes, men who had been favored by Odin for decades, who found themselves suddenly abandoned on the battlefield. In the heat of their final fight, they would look for the god who had guided their hands, only to realize he had tripped them. He would break their swords or cause their horses to stumble at the precise moment of victory. When these dying men asked why he had betrayed them, his answer was always the same: he needed them now. The threat of the wolf at the door was so great that he could no more afford to let a great warrior live than a smith could afford to leave iron in the cold. He was a god who loved his warriors the way a butcher loves a well-fed calf. Their courage was a commodity to be stockpiled, their lives a currency he was more than willing to spend. This leaves us with a portrait of a deity who viewed the entirety of human history as a long-term recruitment drive. The suffering of widows and the burning of villages were merely the overhead costs of his grand strategic vision. He was building a wall of human spirits to stand between him and his own inevitable end. Every man who sat at his table in Valhalla, drinking the mead of the goat Hadron and eating the meat of Seirhimnir, was a victim of a celestial shell game. They thought they had earned a place in paradise through their own merit. They didn't realize they were just being kept on ice, held in a golden cage until the Allfather decided it was time for them to die a second, final time. He was a man who had seen the end of all things in the stars, and in his desperation to survive it, he turned the afterlife into a factory of war and the living world into his personal slaughterhouse. The burden of his knowledge had stripped him of his humanity, leaving only a strategist who saw the souls of his children as nothing more than sandbags against the coming tide. As the fires of the human world burned, lit by his own hand, he sat on his throne and watched the tally of the fallen rise, satisfied that his barracks were nearly full. Even with a hall overflowing with the greatest warriors of history, the Allfather found no relief from the silence of his own mind. Power, as he discovered, is not a collective experience, it is a solitary confinement. Yet standing just outside the golden light of the high seat was the one figure who had always been allowed to walk in the shadows of the king. To understand the burden of the father, one must understand the role of the brother. Long before the walls of his great city were finished, when the world was still raw and the laws of the gods were being written in the marrow of the earth, Odin had not looked to his own kin for companionship. Instead, he found a mirror in Loki. They were not father and son, despite what the stories of later ages would claim. They were brothers of the vein. In a ritual lost to the fog of the first days, they had mixed their blood, a pact that bound their souls in a knot that even the Norns could not easily untangle. Odin saw in Loki a sharp, jagged intelligence that lacked the weight of responsibility. Loki was the friction that kept the world from growing stagnant. If the Allfather was the cold, unyielding structure of the universe, Loki was the spark that threatened to burn it all down. For a long time, Odin tolerated the chaos, perhaps even craved it, as it was the only thing that could surprise a man who had already seen the end of time. This tolerance, however, was pushed to a breaking point when the fruits of Loki's hidden life began to emerge from the dark corners of the world. Loki did not father kings or poets, he sired the very instruments of the apocalypse. From a union with a giantess in the depths of a dark wood, 3 children were born who defied the natural order of the gods. When they were brought before the high seat, the air in the hall turned thin and cold. First was Hel, a girl whose presence was an affront to life itself, half her body blooming with the pink of youth, and the other half gray and withered with the rot of the grave. Then came Jormungandr, a serpent of such unnatural growth that the stone floors seemed to groan under its weight even in its infancy. Finally, there was the wolf, Fenrir. Even as a pup, his eyes held a gaze that was not animal, but ancient and accusing. The other gods looked at these 3 and saw only monsters that needed to be put to the sword. But Odin, his lone eye fixed on the horizon of the future, saw something much worse. He saw the physical manifestations of his own failure. He saw the teeth that would one day find his throat and the poison that would turn the sky to ash. Instead of immediate execution, which a simpler king might have ordered, Odin chose the path of the strategist. He believed that he could outmaneuver fate by managing these threats rather than ending them. He cast the serpent Jormungandr into the deepest trenches of the great ocean, hoping the crushing pressure of the salt and the dark would stifle its growth. Instead, the serpent thrived in the abyss, growing until its body could encircle the entire world, biting its own tail to hold the earth together until the day it decides to let go. He sent Hel to the frozen, sunless depths of the north, granting her dominion over the inglorious dead, those who died of sickness or old age rather than in the glory of battle. In doing so, he unknowingly provided her with a silent, infinite army of ghosts, waiting for a queen to lead them back into the light. But the wolf remained. Fenrir was kept in the heart of the god's home, watched over by Tyr, the god of justice and the only one brave enough to offer the beast a hand filled with meat as it grew at an impossible, terrifying rate. The presence of the wolf became a suffocating weight on the peace of the hall. Every morning he was larger, his growl vibrating in the very foundations of the mountains. The gods realized that they could no longer pretend the beast was a pet. They decided they must be bound, but they knew that force would be met with force. They turned the binding into a game, a challenge to the wolf's legendary pride. Twice they forged massive chains of iron, the strongest links ever hammered by divine hands. Twice Fenrir allowed himself to be bound, and twice he shattered the metal with a single effortless stretch of his limbs. The gods laughed to hide their terror, but Odin knew time was running out. He sent word to the depths of the earth, to the master smiths who understood the weight of things that cannot be seen. They crafted Gleipnir. It did not look like a chain. It looked like a ribbon of silk, thin and soft to the touch. Yet it was fashioned from 6 impossible ingredients: the noise of a cat's footstep, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, the breath of a fish, and the spittle of a bird. It was a chain made of things that do not exist, and therefore it could not be broken by anything that did. When the gods brought the ribbon to the wolf on the island of Lingui, Fenrir sensed the trap. He looked at the thin cord and then at the faces of the gods, seeing the desperation behind their smiles. He refused to be bound unless one of them placed a hand in his mouth as a sign of good faith, a guarantee that this was truly just a game of strength and not a web of deceit. A heavy silence fell. The gods looked away, unwilling to pay the price of their safety. Only Tyr, the most honorable among them, stepped forward. He placed his right hand between the wolf's massive yellow fangs. As the gods wrapped the silken cord around Fenrir's limbs and the wolf felt the magic take hold, tightening with every struggle, he realized the betrayal. The gods cheered as the beast fell, trapped by a ribbon he could not break. In that moment of triumph, the wolf's jaws snapped shut, severing Tyr's hand. The laughter died in the throats of the gods as they looked upon the bloody stump and the bound, screaming wolf. Odin did not join in the celebration. He stood at the edge of the clearing, looking into the eyes of the creature he had raised and then broken. This was the great irony of his reign. In his desperate attempt to prevent the prophecies of his death, he had become the primary architect of the resentment that would fuel it. By binding the wolf, he had turned a potential ally into an eternal enemy. By casting away the serpent and the daughter, he had given them the space and the motive to become the very monsters he feared. Every action he took to safeguard his throne served only to sharpen the blades that would eventually cut him down. The chains on Fenrir were not just holding back a beast, they were anchoring the Allfather to a destiny he had spent his entire life trying to outrun. He returned to his high seat and sat in the shadows, listening to the distant, muffled howling of the wolf, knowing that the silence he had purchased was not peace, but merely the long, slow intake of breath before the final scream. The silence was the first thing to change. It was no longer the expectant hush of a predator waiting in the woods, but a heavy, suffocating blanket that settled over the golden halls of the Aesir. For centuries, the Allfather had lived with the echoes of the future ringing in his ears, a cacophony of wolves and fire that only he could hear. But when the mistletoe pierced the chest of his favorite son, the noise stopped. In its place came a clarity that was far more terrifying than any vision. Balder, the god of light, the one being in all the worlds who was loved by every stone, every tree, and every living soul, lay crumpled on the earth. And as Odin looked down at the pale face of his child, he realized that the long, slow intake of breath he had been dreading was finally over. The scream had begun. To the other gods, this was a moment of impossible shock. They stood frozen, their laughter still hanging in the air like a bitter aftertaste. They looked at the blind god Hodor, who held the fatal twig with trembling hands, and they looked at Loki, whose smile had finally vanished behind a mask of feigned innocence. But Odin did not look at them. He looked at the sky. He saw the way the gold of the sunset seemed to drain away, replaced by a bruised, sickly purple. He felt the sudden sharp drop in the wind. This was not just the death of a sun, it was the death of an era. The light of the world had been extinguished, and in the gathering gloom, the shadows were growing teeth. Odin's grief was a strange, cold thing. A father should have been allowed to collapse, to wail and tear his robes, and demand that the Norns account for this cruelty. But Odin was more than a father. He was the architect of this existence, the one who had traded his eye for the wisdom to see the end coming. He had known this day would come. He had sent his queen to every corner of the world to extract oaths from every substance that they would never harm Balder. He had built a fortress of precautions around his son, believing that if he could just keep the light burning, he could hold back the dark forever. Now, standing over the cooling body of the most beloved god, he saw the vanity of his labor. His wisdom had not saved his son. It had only ensured that he would be the first to truly understand what his son's death meant. The burden of the All-Father shifted in that moment. It was no longer the weight of management or the stress of kingship. It was the weight of a countdown. As he watched the gods prepare the funeral ship, Hringhorni, Odin moved like a man underwater. He whispered into the ear of his dead son a secret word that no other soul would ever know, perhaps a final apology or a desperate promise. But as the ship was pushed into the waves and the flames began to climb toward the stars, the first flake of snow fell. It did not drift down softly like a winter's blessing. It was gray and heavy, smelling of iron and old graves. This was the beginning of Fimbulwinter, the great winter that would last for 3 years without a single summer to break its grip. It was not a natural season. It was a spiritual decay manifesting in the weather. The sun still rose, but it provided no warmth. The moon still shone, but it gave no comfort. The frost began to creep up the pillars of the great halls, turning the gold to dull, brittle lead. The gods, who had always walked with the confidence of immortals, began to huddle together. They looked to Odin for a plan, for a spell, for some way to reignite the hearth of the world. But for the first time, they saw the cracks in their king. Odin's face had become a map of his failures. The wrinkles around his single eye were deeper, like canyons carved by a relentless tide. He had spent his life hoarding secrets and chasing power to avert this very outcome, and yet the snow continued to pile up against the doors of Asgard. The morale of the gods did not break at once. It eroded. It vanished in the way they stopped singing, the way they checked their weapons with a frantic, nervous energy, and the way they stopped looking each other in the eye. They knew. Even without the Allfather's foresight, they could feel the heartbeat of the world slowing down. As the snow buried the fields and the rivers turned to solid stone, the psychological weight of the Allfather's foreknowledge became a visible aura around him. He walked through the halls of Valhalla not as a triumphant commander, but as a man walking to his own execution. He knew that the death of Balder was the first domino. He knew that the chains of the wolf were fraying. He knew that the great serpent was stirring in the depths of the ocean, its scales grinding against the floor of the world. Each flake of snow was a second ticked off the clock. The Allfather had bought his wisdom with blood and pain, thinking it would give him the edge he needed to win the final battle. But as the Fimbul winter deepened, he realized the cruel joke the universe had played on him. Knowing the end does not give you the power to change it. It only robs you of the peace of the present. While the other gods mourned a brother and a friend, Odin was already mourning the entire world. He was mourning the trees that would burn, the stars that would fall, and the men who would freeze in the dark. He stood on the balcony of his high seat, looking out over a white, silent wasteland, and he felt the cold finally reach his heart. The time of the Aesir was running out, and the king of the gods was the only one who knew exactly how much it was going to hurt when the end finally arrived. The silence was over. The winter was here, and the Allfather was alone in the cold. The biting wind of Fimbul winter does more than freeze the skin. It numbs the soul. These 3 years of darkness have stripped away the thin veneer of civilization, leaving the worlds of men and gods raw and bleeding. Odin stands atop the walls of his great hall, watching the stars vanish one by one. He does not need to consult the stones or the high seat anymore. The prophecy is no longer a distant threat whispered by a dead seer. It is the breath on the back of his neck. The frost has settled deep into the wood of the world tree, and the great wolf has finally broken his chains. This is the moment the Allfather spent eons trying to bypass, to outrun, or to bargain away. Every secret he stole, every eye he traded, and every drop of blood he spilled was meant to prevent this sunrise. Yet here he is, watching the horizon turn the color of dried blood. He moves with a heavy, deliberate grace. He dons his gold helmet, not for the sake of vanity, but because a king must look like a king when he goes to the slaughterhouse. He takes up Gungnir, the spear that never misses its mark. But as he feels the familiar weight of the shaft, he knows that even a perfect strike cannot kill the inevitable. There is a terrible clarity in his movements. He is the architect of his own destruction, having raised the very beast that now comes to claim him. He fed the wolf, he chained the wolf, and in doing so, he ensured the wolf would be hungry enough to swallow the sun. The march to the plain of Vigrid is a journey through a nightmare. The landscape is a jagged mess of broken ice and scorched earth. Around him, his chosen warriors, the Einarhar, follow him with a fervor born of madness. They believe in glory, they believe in a warrior's death, but Odin sees past the slogans. He sees the meat and the bone. He sees the futility of their courage. As they reach the expanse that stretches 100 leagues in every direction, the scale of the disaster becomes undeniable. The ship Naglfar, built from the nails of the dead, cuts through the frozen sea. The giants approach like mountains given legs. The Midgard serpent rises, its poison choking the very air. but Odin has eyes for only one thing. Amidst the chaos of screaming gods and shattering steel, a shadow looms larger than the rest. Fenrir is no longer a creature, he is an environmental disaster. His maw is an open grave. When he breathes, fires erupt. When he moves, the earth cracks. The Allfather looks at the monster and sees the personification of every mistake he ever made. This is the bill coming due. Every lie told for the sake of the greater good, every manipulation of fate, every cold-hearted sacrifice at the well of wisdom, it all culminates in those yellow eyes and those jagged teeth. There is no music here. There are no trumpets sounding a heroic charge. There is only the wet thud of boots on gore and the howling of a wind that wants to erase everything. Odin's spurs Sleipnir forward. The eight-legged horse gallops toward the mouth of the abyss. This is the narrative climax of a life built on the pursuit of power and the avoidance of pain. It is a moment of profound bravery, but it is a hollow bravery. He is not fighting to save the world. He knows the world is already dead. He is fighting because the script demands it, and he is the only one who has read the final page. The confrontation is brief. In the sagas, they might tell of a struggle that shook the foundations of the universe, but the reality is much more visceral. Odin raises his spear. The runes etched into the metal glow with a fading, desperate light. He strikes. Gungnir finds its mark, piercing the hide of the beast. But a spear is nothing to a creature that can swallow the sky. The wolf does not recoil. He does not scream. He simply opens his mouth wider. The upper jaw of Fenrir touches the heavens, and the lower jaw rests upon the earth. In that singular, terrifying instant, Odin is nothing more than a speck of gold in a sea of fur and teeth. There is no final speech. There are no trumpets sounding a heroic charge. There is only the crushing weight of reality. The Allfather is swallowed whole. The source of all wisdom, the king of the gods, the master of magic, vanishes into the dark throat of the wolf. He is gone in a single, visceral snap of bone. It is the ultimate anticlimax. The death of a god should be a cosmic event, but here it feels like a chore being finished. The wolf has fed. The king is dead. And the eons Odin spent obsessing over this moment, the sacrifices he made to understand the nature of his end, did nothing to soften the blow. He died knowing exactly how it would feel. He died knowing that his wisdom was a curse that only allowed him to watch his own death in slow motion for 1,000 years. The silence that follows is not the peace of a life well lived, but the empty quiet of a debt finally paid in full. The cold he feared has finally claimed him, and the world he tried to protect is left to burn in his absence. This was the cost of his crown and the price of his foresight. He knew the end, he fought the end, and in the end he was exactly where he was always meant to be, consumed by the very fate he tried to outsmart. As the fires of the final battle faded into the cold gray of a winter that would not end, the silence became the Allfather's only monument. The wolf had finished its work, the sun had been swallowed, and the gods who once shaped the stars were nothing more than smoke and memory. Yet the prophecy Odin feared was not an end, but a transformation. From the boiling depths of the sea, a new earth began to lift its head. It was a world of vivid green, washed clean of the ancient bloodstains and the heavy debts of the Aesir. In the tall grass of this new dawn, the survivors gathered. Vidar and Vali, the sons who outlived the storm, walked the ground where their fathers once feasted. They found the golden chess pieces of the old gods scattered in the soil, remnants of a game that had finally reached its conclusion. Humanity, too, crawled from the hollows of the world tree, blinking at a sun that felt softer, less predatory. Odin had given everything to ensure this survival, yet his name was already beginning to slip into the shadows of the past. The cycle he fought to control had simply moved beyond him. As the centuries turned, the physical world of the North began to shift. The long ships that once carried his name to distant shores grew quiet, and the smoke of the sacrificial fires was replaced by the smell of incense. The arrival of the White Christ into Scandinavia marked the true twilight of the Allfather. This new faith did not merely compete with Odin, it sought to overwrite him. The missionaries and the converted kings saw the old god not as a tragic seeker of wisdom, but as a deceitful ghost of a dark age. His pursuit of knowledge was reframed as sorcery, and his mastery of the runes was cast aside as the work of the devil. The one-eyed wanderer was forced into a long, slow exile. He was no longer the king of the gods, but a beggar on the fringes of the village. His attributes were stripped down and distorted. The wisdom that cost him an eye was now whispered to be a sign of a sinister pact. His two ravens, once his eyes and ears upon the world, were turned into omens of death and misfortune. By the Middle Ages, the Allfather had been reduced to a figure of fear, a shadow that haunted the peripheral vision of the common folk. He became the leader of the wild hunt, a spectral army of the dead that tore through the winter sky. When the wind howled through the eaves of a farmhouse and the dogs barked at the empty air, people no longer toasted to Odin's health. They barred their doors and crossed themselves against the terrifying ghost who rode on the storm. Even his sacred tree was chopped down to make room for the steeples of stone churches. The complexity of his burden, the weight of knowing the end and struggling anyway, was flattened into a simple story of pagan error. Yet Odin proved more resilient than the icons that tried to bury him. He survived in the cadence of the languages spoken across the North, in the names of the days of the week, and in the deep-seated cultural obsession with fate and the preservation of one's legacy. He remains the architect of a worldview that prizes the struggle over the victory, a reminder that the cost of sight is always a loss of innocence. The Allfather's story didn't end with a wolf's jaw or a priest's sermon. It simply became the foundation upon which the modern world was built, a silent gray presence watching from the edge of the woods, waiting for the wind to change. The wind did eventually change, shifting from the cold gales of the North Atlantic to the quiet rustle of turning pages in a library. While the stone temples fell and the old sacrifices ceased, the figure of the wanderer remained etched into the collective subconscious of the modern world. He moved from the blood-stained battlefield to the ink-stained bookshelf, shedding his iron mail for the weathered robes of the scholar and the crooked staff of the pilgrim. This survival was not an accident of history, but a testament to how deeply the Allfather's archetype is buried within our understanding of what it means to be wise and what it truly costs to be powerful. We see him most clearly in the flickering shadows of our modern myths. When Tolkien first conceptualized the wizard Gandalf, he did not look to the whimsical magicians of light-hearted fairy tales. He looked directly to the Odinic wanderer, the gray-clad traveler with a wide-brimmed hat and a staff, moving unnoticed through the lands of ordinary men to nudge the heavy wheels of fate. This is Odin, the master strategist, the mentor who possesses secret knowledge of the ancient world and warns of the coming storm that others are too blind to see. But the archetype goes far deeper than mere appearance or a choice of clothing. In the psychological frameworks pioneered by Carl Jung, the wise old man represents the spirit of enlightenment and the breakthrough of consciousness. Yet he is never without a profound shadow. Odin is a figure of terrifying duality, a mirror reflecting our own human capacity for both profound insight and ruthless, cold-blooded pragmatism. He is the primary inspiration for the modern anti-hero, perhaps best exemplified by characters like Neil Gaiman's Mr. Wednesday, a man who is charming, ancient, and utterly dangerous. He reminds us that wisdom is rarely a benevolent gift. It is sharp, it is heavy, and it often demands a price that most are unwilling to pay. This is the God who stole the mead of poetry through seduction and deceit, reminding us that art and intellect are often born from a hunger that can never be fully satisfied. Why does this ancient, one-eyed figure still command our attention in an age of silicon and satellites? It is because Odin represents the ultimate human paradox. He is the only god who lives with the exact knowledge of his own expiration date. Unlike the deities of other cultures who exist in a state of eternal, unchanging perfection, Odin is constantly moving toward a deadline. He has seen the vision of the final battle. He knows the wolves will eventually catch the sun and the moon, and he knows that he will fall between the jaws of the beast. This foreknowledge does not lead him to surrender or despair, but to a frantic, relentless pursuit of preparation. This mirrors the fundamental burden of our own condition. We are the only creatures who live with the constant, nagging awareness of our own ending. We know that the fire will go out, yet we spend our lives gathering wood. We trade our time for knowledge and our physical vitality for the clarity of experience, just as he traded his eye at the well of Mimir. We seek to leave a mark, to find a pattern in the chaos, and to ensure that something of our spirit survives the transition into the silence. Odin is the personification of the grit required to face a finite existence. He tells us that the value of a life is not measured by its length, but by the weight of the wisdom gathered along the way. He is the patron of the seeker, who understands that the struggle for meaning is the only thing that justifies the pain of being alive. As we look out into the gray woods of our own uncertain future, we find him there still, reminding us that even in a world destined to end, the search for truth is a victory that time cannot take away. It is the one-eyed gaze that looks at the dark and refuses to blink.